Hi, I'm Kate from dailytarotgirl.com, and today I'm going to be talking with Benebell Wen. And Benebell is the author of Holistic Tarot, and her website is benebellwen.com. She's got an awesome blog, and she has an upcoming book called The Tao of Craft that's going to be out in September. So welcome, Benebell.
Hi, Kate. How are you? Thank you for
Good.
having me.
Yeah. So I talked with you it was over a year ago. And that was right when Holistic Tarot, I think, was about to be published or just was published. It was very new.
Yes.
And so I think probably a lot has changed since Holistic Tarot has come out,
Uh,
and a lot of exciting changes there.
yes.
hmm Okay, and I'm so excited to talk with you again about tarot because I know we had like a really good conversation last time. And, we talked about a whole bunch of really important issues with tarot, and I kind of was hoping to do kind of a similar thing this time with you.
Yeah.
And yeah, so one
You
of the,
surprised people by not being fluffy, if I recall correctly. Do you
yeah,
remember that? Just a reference. Go on.
I remember that comment, yeah. So, Uh, one issue that I keep noticing in people's comments and emails that I get is that there's a lot of people out there who are drawn to tarot. They're interested in tarot. There's something about tarot that is drawing them in and they want to learn about it, but they're scared to learn about it. So they either they're worried that tarot has some kind of magical ability to change their lives, possibly in a negative way. A lot of people I know, if they're brought up with religion, might have certain kind of beliefs or ideas about tarot being connected to the devil or evil, or a lot of people, what they say is, I was taught that tarot is this thing and you just don't go there. You don't open that door and invite that into your life. And I was lucky that I I didn't really have any of those negative kind of preconceived ideas about tarot when I first started learning about tarot. I didn't have that upbringing or that background, and so it was really easy for me to learn tarot in a way that's fearless. And I realized that a lot of other people don't have that luxury. So I just want to get your take on that. Were you ever afraid of tarot when you first started learning about it?
I think I was like you. I didn't really have preconceived notions going in terms of what I actually believed in for myself. I was very cognizant that it was in the social environment, right? That people out there, and particularly certain religions, might not take kindly to this kind of work. But for myself, as in what was really ingrained into me, no, I didn't have any fear around it. So I was really open to learning it, studying it, and also once I started opening up books on the topic and reading it for myself, it felt almost like an academic study because how much history is there and how much, knowledge is embedded into every single card. So for me, I didn't have that fear.
Okay, good. So for you, like and I'm sure you've encountered people that have that fear about tarot and some of those beliefs. What advice would you have for someone who really wants to learn tarot and they feel drawn to tarot, but they also have some negative ideas kicking around?
Ooh. Well, I think tarot is a tool, and don't underestimate the power of psychology. If there's something about it that feels extraordinarily occult to you, the tarot does become extraordinarily occult. And if it's just a form of psychotherapy, that's all it is. Well, it's all about your mind and what you sort of set into the tarot. Now, if you find are already calibrated mentally and emotionally in such a way where there is that sort of fear. Most people have particular religious beliefs. They subscribe to certain ideas and notions. Maybe create a sacred space around you that brings in the light or the deity or something that protects you, that makes you feel very protected and shielded. And if you create that space and then work with tarot, study tarot within that space, I think that's sort of an initial step to feel comfortable working with it. And then once you begin working with it, because you feel like you're being protected, it's an established space where no negative energy can come through, you're basically opening your mind up to studying it more intently. And then I think eventually you'll see that the sacred space is there whether or not you invoke it. And so you'll learn to practice tarot more fluently after that. But initially, to get over that fear, I think bringing in your religion helps a lot. So I sometimes do that. If I am afraid in any sort of exercise I'm doing that happens to be more metaphysical, I'll bring in my religious beliefs and just sort of establish a light or protective space based on my religious ideologies. And that can really help somebody.
Yeah, I like that. And I really like that idea of that creating that sacred space. One thing that came to mind when you were talking is I know a lot of people find like oracle cards, and I'm sure you've heard of Doreen Virtue. She's got tons of decks out, and a lot of them are well, all of them actually are very kind of gentle, and they have kind of safe imagery and stuff like that. And I know a lot of people are more drawn to working with cards that are kind of like that, just because they feel a little more like warm and fuzzy than some other tarot decks. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know that there's some people that sort of are critical of decks like that, and they're critical of like oracle card decks and decks that are kind of more touchy-feely, warm and fuzzy, with angels and stuff like that on them. And they want the kind of like the hardcore tarot. What's your take on that? How do you feel about that?
Well, my take on angels and angelic beings is not touchy-feely. I think that that is, in my worldview, that's really something that's there, and it is something that is invoked. But in terms of decks that really draw upon superficial elements of the metaphysical and just make it very fluffy and fun and airy, I think if it works for somebody and it's something that helps you tap into your intuition, that's all there is to it. That's the end of the discussion. What my opinion is has no bearing or relevance in terms of your work with those decks. And I don't want anyone to think that my opinion needs to have any relevance in their relationships with their decks. As for me, I tend not to work with I find that I like something that's truthful and it's not stripped of something in any way whatsoever. And so, I don't really work with themed decks either for that same reason. And so for me, I think, I don't understand how it can be light and fluffy. It almost feels disingenuous this in certain contexts because it's almost like, to bring in Christian religion, right? It's almost like the concept of the Antichrist in many ways, isn't it? How there is this sort of, perception that makes you feel comfortable and drawn in, but then ultimately it's still something else. And so I think at the end of the day, tarot is tarot, oracle is oracle, and whatever polish you put to it isn't going to change the character of the structure of tarot. Again, if it helps you, then that's great, but it's not going to be safer. It's not actually safer. It's not more dangerous. It's not safer. It is what it is. It just has a different coating. And so as long as you're cognizant of a different coating, and maybe if that coating appeals to your aesthetics, that's great. But just know it's a coating. It's not safer.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And I find like some of those, light and fluffy decks and those really positive decks, for me, it's really helped me see some of the more scary cards in a different light. And so then when I'm reading with those, with the just my regular tarot cards, it helps me when some of those cards, like the Tower or the Devil come up. I feel like I have a much bigger array of possible meanings, and I have a bigger toolbox to take from when I'm doing a reading. So for me, that's how those kinds of decks have helped my reading, even though I don't always necessarily read with decks like that. I prefer, well, I find if I'm doing a reading for another person, or if I'm feeling really good, I prefer just a traditional tarot deck. But then if you're having like a bad day and you're feeling kind of like vulnerable, sometimes like angel cards or something is kind of what you need. I think it depends for me, it depends on my mood that I'm in at any given
And
day.
that's a very human thing. It's just like sometimes I want to hear, sometimes when I say, how do I look? I want the truth. Sometimes I don't want the truth. If I say, how do I look? You got to say, I look great. I just want to hear something that makes me feel good about myself. And I mean, I'm aware of that. And as long as there's a self-awareness there, I think it's perfectly fine. But there's something for every occasion. You have to take it into context. Yeah, absolutely. So
Hmm.
I do like that approach that you're talking about. I find that I do that as well. I have many different decks that I work with, and then when I work with their companion guidebooks and learn the meanings for that particular deck, it is actually crosses over, and I apply it to general meanings for cards as I work with, the regular decks. So
Right,
I really
right.
like that
Okay.
idea.
Oh,
It's
nice.
a good idea.
So I want to come back to what we were originally talking about. So people being scared of tarot and being hesitant about tarot. I'm really curious to get your take on why you think that is. Because I know, I mean, obviously, if someone's brought up to believe that tarot is dangerous, they might think that. But I'm curious why particular religions or groups have kind of demonized tarot and why they've cast it in a negative light in the first place. And I know that you have a lot of knowledge of history and you have a big background of that. So I'd love to get your take on this.
I think is one large part history in terms of having this, you can trace it back to many laws that were against tarot and against divination by the church. And also, if you're talking East in Eastern traditions, that happens as well, where at some point they do start imposing laws against forms of divination and witchcraft. And I think it's because, when one religious institution is ascending to power, to hold on to that power, you have to castigate every single other religion. It's something you have to do to maintain your power. And so it makes sense that you're going to bring down other religions and their practices. And certain religions, especially pagan, of the pagan persuasion, they do tend to call in more, divination and things like that. And this is both in the Eastern traditions and the Western traditions, which is very interesting. Like the folk religions of China are also much more gravitated toward divination, fortune telling, witchcraft, ceremonial magic, things like that. And so I think it's one part history. And then after a certain point, people who are within that tradition or within that religion, they've kept the prejudices and the biases, but they forget the history and they don't know where this prejudice comes from. It's just something that they continue to sort of parrot. So it's one part that, but I also think that, there is sort of a tension between exoteric religion and esoteric religion, where exoteric is sort of almost in one sense accepting a mainstream doctrine, accepting sort of this public perception of theoretical doctrine. Whereas exoteric is about sort of coming into your own, being more individualistic, more egotistical, and not necessarily in a bad way, but just being more of an individualist when it comes to finding your own spiritual path. So I think somebody who is so the exoteric world, the mainstream, if you have somebody who's going into the exoteric and taking their own divergent path, that's not something you want because that's one less person in your congregation. And so I think that's why there's always been this disconnect between, this mainstream religion in any culture, the mainstream religion versus those who practice divination or craft, because practicing divination and craft is a form of empowerment that I think a lot of people are afraid of. And so that's where it comes from. I think
Yeah,
that's just my
yeah.
theory.
That's very similar to my theory on tarot in that I think that tarot, and I haven't studied a lot of other crafts very well, but I know that with tarot, it really um, it makes you, question things, and it's very empowering, and you learn about yourself. I think it kind of takes you on this journey into yourself, and I think that is very empowering. And um, it seems like that would be something that any kind of institution, and not necessarily a religious institution, but there's lots of other like cultural institutions I can think of. Something like tarot and what it does could be so threatening for those instances. I think it emphasize the individual and individuality, and kind of finding your own answers, and going within yourself, and learning about your own rules and your own ideas about things, and not necessarily following this formula on how to live and how to think.
I agree, but the paradoxical thing for me is that tarot practice, astrology, divination, all of these forms of practices have actually strengthened my belief in a God. Before I definitely leaned more atheistic, and I didn't believe there was a greater unifying pattern. When I say God, I do use that term very loosely. It's not tied to any particular religion. In the Western world, God is just the one that we use. Spirit, universe, whatever word works for you. But I believe now very strongly that there is a unifying collective unconscious. Whereas I think before I got that into tarot, I was questioning it. I wasn't sure. I was sort of on the fence. And so I was more atheistic before I got really immersed into the study. So in many ways, believing in that unifying collective unconscious, tarot divination has made me more religious.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And just while you were talking, thinking of all the weird, spooky experiences I've had with tarot, that absolutely right. You can't spend time learning tarot and then not, be aware of this greater, like a collective unconscious that's going on.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I want to ask you a little bit about your upcoming book, and it's called The Tao of Craft. Can you tell us a little bit about, what it's about?
Well, I can't believe you pronounced it correctly.
Oh.
Tao. That is really cool.
Oh.
I actually say Tao only because I grew up in the Western world. So when I speak Chinese, I speak Chinese, like Mandarin. And then when I speak English, it's funny, I just take on the English pronunciation of Chinese words. So I say the Tao, Taoism, and I was like, oh, wait, Tao. Well, yeah, if you want to speak Mandarin, so you actually said it correctly. It is Tao. But then, I'm just so used to saying Tao because if I say Tao, sometimes people, anyway, so that's really cool. I thought that was interesting that you pronounced it correctly. It does diverge a bit from tarot for this second book. I wanted to talk about Fu sigil crafting. Fu talismans is a form of sigil that's very much the meat and potatoes of Eastern esoteric traditions. And I wanted to explore mostly the history and cultural context of this practice. So it is more of a historic treatise, a lot more, for example, holistic tarot. Holistic tarot, like I spent one chapter on history, and the rest of it is just on the practice of tarot. Whereas this book, I think more than half of it is on history, the cultural traditions within this practice, and also just the fundamental principles. Like I get into what does qi, what is qi? I talk about the yin and the yang, yin yang, yin or yang, and I talk about the trinity in the theory of craft and all of that stuff, the bakwa, the eight trigams. So it's more on theory and history than it is on practice, but it actually gets very much into practice as well. So I do instruct on how to craft talismans.
Mm-hmm. Oh, cool. That sounds awesome. And it comes out in September?
Yeah, September 27th.
Wonderful. So are you into like Wicca and witchcraft and those kinds of things?
I think it's fascinating, and I think I gravitate toward learning about that. And again, I think more from, I don't know if it's the word academic, but I'm just very intrigued by these topics and understanding what they believe, why they believe that, and the context for that. So I'm very interested in that. I personally don't practice those traditions, so mine tends to be more Eastern based.
Okay, okay. It's interesting what you say about, studying something from an academic perspective. I know for me, I've studied a lot of different religions and things from an academic perspective. And then a few years ago, I kind of dabbled in Wicca and kind of played around with doing some spells and stuff like that. And it was, it's not something that I do on a regular basis now, but it was really amazing, like some of the experiences that I had, and it just gave me such a different understanding of it, having like experienced it versus just kind of reading about it. It's like such a different thing. And then I to all the religions that I've just read about, and I'm not about to go practicing a bunch of religions just to get the experience. But I thought it was interesting, like the difference between reading about something and experiencing it, it's a different thing. I know you probably have certain practices and stuff that you've experienced on a personal level too.
Yeah, and it's funny how the Eastern practices in witchcraft are so strikingly similar to the practices that I study and read about in Wicca and Western witchcraft. There's so much overlap. They're basically the same fundamental principles repackaged with different vocabulary. It's really strange. The idea of, a god and a goddess, the idea of a triplicity of some kind, some form of trinity, that is holy and sacred, working with the elements and having to invoke the four directions anytime you establish sacred space. All of these things cross over between the cultures, and I don't understand why or how different civilizations can come to and arrive at the same conclusions about craft. It's really fascinating.
It is fascinating because, yeah, they originated in totally different parts of the world. I mean, I get some of it. Like I can see how there's the four elements because you've got four seasons, and I guess depending on where you live, like I, I guess the further away from the equator you are, the more obvious those seasons are. So I mean, that makes sense to me that there would be like the four elements, four seasons. I'm not sure the Trinity, like where that comes from though. I know there's books and books written about this, but
And then also the focus on moon phases and doing a lot of timing to the moon. That's another, I mean, that's a huge thing in Eastern culture. So,
yes, yeah. Actually, I'm just planting a veggie garden, and my mom who's like not really into like moon phases and stuff like that, and she said, she's like, oh, make sure that you look at the moon phases and plant according to what the moon's doing.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, our ancestors of old did that. So I think
Hmm.
it's fascinating that she brought that advice in. Very cool.
Yeah. So when you're giving a tarot reading, because I believe you do professional readings through your site, is that right?
Yep,
Okay.
that's right.
Okay. So when you're giving a reading for someone, um, how much of your reading do you feel is intuition, and how much are you drawing on your solid knowledge? of tarot?
Ooh, see, I don't know how to answer that question. If there's a split number, like, oh, it's 60% intuition, 40% analysis. I mean, I don't know. I think it's based on that specific moment. I think like any practice, any form of art, you need to have a very, very solid foundation of knowledge, which is just pure black and white knowledge that becomes sort of like muscle memory inside your mind. So that when I do an actual reading for it can be art. It's no longer analysis. It's pure art. It's pure intuition. But I can't say it's pure intuition because that pure intuition is based on a really solid foundation of knowledge. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like 60% here, 40% here, or 50-50, and it's mutually exclusive. And, 1 minute I'm doing analysis and 1 minute I'm doing, it's not like that. It's really just because of this strong analytical background, I can then throw it out. I have the privilege of throwing it out during a reading and being intuitive. I think if you don't have that foundational knowledge and you're just trying to be intuitive, that's not intuition, that's guesswork.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
don't know how responsible that is. I think having that knowledge is very important in doing divination.
Mm-hmm. Um, it's interesting. I just started doing kick lessons. And yesterday, I was like punching the bag, and the instructor came up to me and she's like, okay, you're like kind of, what you're doing is okay, but you're sort of like blending different moves. And really, you just need to learn the basic moves and do them first. And then once you're good at the basic moves, then you can get artsy fartsy and blend stuff um, and kind of do your own thing. But you can't just start doing your own thing right at the beginning. You've got to learn the basic stuff first and get really comfortable with that, and then you can break the rules. And I think that that's kind of the same with
Absolutely.
everything, really, but it's the same with
It's
tarot.
absolutely true. And it's totally applicable to tarot as well. You need to be able to isolate all of the basic techniques and spend time with the techniques in a very clinical way. And then, of course, you're not being clinical during an actual reading. But if you're not clinical prior to the reading, you can't actually be truly intuitive and artistic during a reading.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you're someone who is very, you're very intellectual, you're grounded, you're level-headed, and how like
I'm like, okay.
okay, maybe you about yourself, but you come across, being someone who is very comfortable in the rational kind of realm. You can communicate clearly, and you read books. So
I read, that's true.
so as someone who's very intellectual and can be very rational, what kinds of things do you do to feed your intuition and um, let your intuition blossom?
Um, I think for me, it's one part faith. Again, I think from many, many years of practicing tarot craft and other forms of, metaphysical endeavors, it's really hard there's some form of faith, some form of, I mean, I don't mean faith as in a religion, but just this intuitive feeling that there's something bigger out there than yourself that connects everything. And because of this connection, you're able to get really substantive information through something like tarot cards. If there wasn't this greater something, whatever it is, if there isn't a greater something, the cards would be meaningless by themselves. And so I think having that faith allows to be more intuitive. I don't know if that's, you know what I mean? I know that when the cards are spread in front of me, there's something greater at work. And so I sort of let that kind of pulse through me. I kind of let that take over.
Mm-hmm.
And it does start with faith, having a faith and then letting that sort of overcome you. It does help me be more intuitive because I understand at some point during a reading, it's not me, it's that connection to that greater something or other out there.
I really like what you said there because it sounds like for you it's more about starting a reading with a particular not impression, but way of looking at things, like a particular perspective, and acknowledging that there is like a greater power out there, and just having that kind of acceptance as you do the reading, and that kind of helps you open up your intuition.
Yeah, definitely. But again, I think if you don't have a very strong analytical and foundational knowledge in tarot and the symbolism in tarot, it's really hard to translate information from that greater something. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because it's basically like you're an interpreter, you're a translator, and the better you are at the language, the better you are, the more precise you can be at translating information from that greater something. If you don't understand the language very well, you're very limited in the way you can translate that information to a client. The more knowledge you have, the more nuanced and more detailed you can get with the translation of that information.
I like the fact that you brought up language because I think tarot is so much like language in that a tarot card can have a whole bunch of different meanings, kind of like the word, there's all different words, like, well, there, that's one word that has different meanings. There's a thinking the other day, and I was like, oh, that has so many different meanings, and now I can't remember what word it was. It was something, and it just has like 5 or 6 totally different meanings. And I know things like that stump people when they're learning a language. Like stuff like that is so confusing. So for you, like with tarot, how do you know if you're interpreting a card correctly? Because you know that there's different ways you can interpret a card. How do you know that you're doing the right way?
It's exactly what you said about language. How do you know bear in this sentence means, a noun and it means like the actual animal? How do you know bear means, to hold something? And it really goes back to having that foundational knowledge. If you understand, elemental dignities, you understand numerology, astrology, you understand all of these different components to tarot. And even if you don't use those particular studies, just understanding how symbolism within the 4 corners of a card work with one another and then how that interacts with other cards out on spread. If you understand that, that's like understanding the sentence. If you know what the sentence is, then you can understand the context of that word bear. And then you know what whether or not it's a noun or a verb. So tarot is very much the same way. In terms of not outside of a reading, it's hard for me to just say, well, now you know that the Ten of Cups means this or it doesn't mean that. You have to see it within the context of the reading. And again, it goes back to knowledge. If you have the knowledge and you have the experience, you can see context very clearly and you know exactly what the death card means in a particular context.
Right.
So again,
Yes.
it goes back to knowledge and education.
Yeah, good advice. So what advice would you have for someone who wants to get really good at tarot and they're learning tarot? Like, do you have a particular way that you think is, the ideal way to study tarot? Like, because I know some people want to approach it like they would approach studying like math or something like that, where like, you spend an hour a day and you start with this, start with that. Was that your approach when you were learning tarot, or did you have more of a looser approach?
Mine was pretty regimented and it was self-imposed regimen. It was something that I decided, I made this decision, okay, at some point when I was, in junior high or high school, I just decided I'm going to learn tarot. And so I just bought as many books, checked out as many texts from the library as I could, and I journaled, I studied, I made flashcards. I mean, I really took it like a course,
Yeah.
And I became very clinical like that. But I remember only reaching sort of a ceiling because that textbook knowledge can only take you so far. And yeah, sure, I can, spew 15 different meanings for one card, but then it shows up in a reading and I'm just like, I have no idea what that means.
Right.
So I think you need practice. This is so important when it comes to tarot. You really need to just, at some point be able to do it from memory and not rely so heavily on books. That's the most difficult point. That point in time when you stop relying on a book and when the cards come to you, you don't immediately feel like you have to reach for a book, That moment is a very difficult point to get to. When you get to that point, you have to resist the temptation of going for the book and just rely on yourself and just trust that you know what that card means, figure it out for yourself and move forward. But you do need practice. So I would say if you're going to take it from my approach, if you're somebody who has my personality, it is very studious and self-imposed discipline for a short amount of time. And then once you feel like you have a sort of motor memory of the cards, you do have to get rid of all of that and not rely on that because then it becomes a crutch and you're never going to advance to the next stage. You get rid of your crutch and then you learn how to read for actual human beings. It's so important to read for people because they can give you feedback and say, no, that's not what it means. And you can learn from your mistakes. Oh, okay, then you learn how to read sort of within the context of humanity.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. That's excellent advice. And I know myself, I went through phases of taking tarot very seriously where I did lots of notes and studying, and then phases where I kind of did the opposite of that and I just kind of played around with the cards and practice and stuff like that. And I know there's one tarot author, Michelle Morgan. I don't know if you've read her book. It's called
It's
A
a yellow
Magical,
book, right? Like
yeah,
a little orange.
yeah, A Magical Course in Tarot. And she kind of, her advice in that book, if I'm remembering correctly, is to kind of feel into the cards first and almost kind of guess what they might mean and kind of use your intuition first to kind of feel out the cards and then learn what the meanings are, which is actually an interesting way to learn tarot. And I kind of read another tarot book first before I read her book, so I'd already kind of learned what the meanings were. But I thought, that's kind of a different approach to learning.
Yeah, that actually is part of the learning process too, in terms of the academic part, going through the cards and letting, when every time you look at a card, you try to figure out what your initial keywords, what your impressions are of that card without any knowledge, and then you turn to a book to see how they stack up. And I think that's a really great way to learn as well. I actually don't see that as intuition, though. I mean, I
Right.
guess it is. I see it as a form of exercise. It's a study exercise where you do that in other studies as well. Okay, well, why don't you go through, this song from beginning to end and try your best to stumble through it? And then once you've played it from beginning to end in a really poor manner, then you go
Yeah.
back and you learn it, from the basics and the technique. So I
Right.
think tarot can be the same way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think also there's a lot of analogy between tarot and dancing. I mean, there's a lot of analogies between tarot and anything, but I know with dancing, when I was doing belly dancing, I could learn a dance and I could do it like technically really well. but it wasn't until I actually like listened to the music and like felt the music and did the dance, and then it would become kind of magical. I feel like tarot is the same. You know, you need to know your choreography, or you need to know your, you know, what the cards mean, blah blah blah, how to do it. And then when you, like you said earlier about, you know, being intuitive and kind of feeling your way through things, that's where the magic happens, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're very
So
much we're on the same wavelength in many ways.
yeah. So, when do you know when you're ready to read for other people? Not necessarily professional readings, but like when did you know? When were you like, okay, now I'm ready to read for someone else other than myself?
I think the truth is you never know. You just do it. You just force
Mhm.
yourself to go out there. You take a risk. You take a gamble with your reputation and you just go for it. But even after many years of professional reading, sometimes, I mean, you still always question, am I ready? Do I feel like I can do it? I think that just happens. It's sort of this imposter syndrome that everybody always has. And so I think to say, oh, I was definitely ready, it would be disingenuous of me to say, and I don't want to say that to somebody and have them feel like, well, I don't feel ready, you know? I think you're right, you don't feel ready, but if you know the cards, just force yourself to do it and force yourself and know that you're going to make mistakes, know that you might not be accurate, and just sort of get over yourself, literally, just get over the fear and just do it. And the more you do it, the more you learn how to deal with your own fear. But to say
Mhm.
that at some point the fear is no longer there, it's just not true. You hear of all of these public figures, like the celebrities, right? And the pop stars who say that before they go on stage, sometimes they still get nerves, you know, even though they've been performing for a decade, they still get nerves when they go on stage. And I think that's the same way with any career path. You still have performance anxiety, and that's just part of the nature of what we do. So
Mhm.
just get over yourself, get out there and do it. That's all you can do. So
Yeah, that's awesome advice. And I almost want to end it right there on a high note, but I have a question that I'm dying to ask you. So, last question I'm going to ask you. How do you come back from a bad reading? Because for me, like the biggest part of my anxiety in reading for others when I first started reading for others was that I might get it wrong and I might give a reading that is so totally inaccurate and just terrible. And I think every tarot reader out there who has given readings has done a reading that where they got stuff wrong. So what's your experience of that been like? And mainly what I want to know is how do you come back from a reading that is maybe not accurate, or even when you're in a reading and you say something and the person's like, no, that's like not that's not true. That makes no sense. You know, how do you come back from that?
this is all about having thick skin, you know, and there's no way to teach somebody to have thick skin. It's just something you have to learn for yourself, you know. And if you're very sensitive or you're very fragile in terms of letting your ego be influenced by what others have to say, this is very, very difficult. Somebody who really is always putting themselves out there, no matter what it is. And it just happens in this case, we're talking about being a professional tarot reader. But in any profession where you're constantly putting yourself out there, even litigators, as a lawyer, sometimes you just suck in court, you know, and it just happens. And now you have a whole jury who watched you suck. You watched opposing counsel has seen you suck, and the judge has seen you suck. What do? You know, you can go back into your house and curl up and never come back out again. Or you can just say, well, you know, shit happens. And I think you just have to have a really thick skin and know that it's not unique to you, no matter who it is out there. The greatest of the great always have those moments when they just botch something up. And this isn't just about tarot readers. Any profession, you know, you see, for example, not to keep on talking about celebrities today for some bizarre reason, but you see it all the time. They go up on stage, they stumble and fall flat on their face, even though they're these, in our minds, these really elegant, refined, and classy people, but they fall flat on their face in front of millions of viewers. It happens. You just have to get over yourself again, and just know that sometimes you get it wrong. And then,
Right.
be able to, the next step is to not be afraid to immediately do a second reading. You have
Yeah.
to not be afraid to do a second reading. And maybe I think a good way to sort of build up your confidence again is to not do a second reading for maybe, a complete stranger. Maybe do a reading for somebody who's going to be extremely supportive of you. And then,
Right.
help you maybe be the crush and help you rebuild your foundation, rebuild your confidence. So that could be
Hmm.
a sort of a crutch that you use if you're not ready to just go out and do a completely different second, stranger reading, but you do need to get back out there. It's about having thick skin and knowing that it happens to any reader. Even the best reader will have a bad day. So I definitely have bad days as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember doing a tarot party, and the first person I got at this tarot party was like the worst reading ever. And this person was like totally disappointed in their reading, and like they're very negative, and they let me know about it. And I remember just being like, oh my God, and now I got to read for like 10 other people, like great. And then the second person I had was like wonderful, and that reading went so well. And then, but throughout the night, there was maybe a couple readings that were like, whatever. And then some readings that were fabulous. And I think I mean, it depends on the person you're reading for, depends on your particular mood, I guess, at that moment. There's so many factors, I think.
And sometimes it's not you. It could be that you gave a fantastic reading, but whatever information was provided during the reading, that person was not receptive of that moment, of the reading at that moment. And I can see that from their perspective, where that's happened to me before. I don't know if it's about divinity. There's times when somebody told me something and it's the truth, but I wasn't ready to hear that truth at that exact moment. And to protect myself, I retaliate. I kind of, I spit back at that person who gave me the truth at the wrong time. And
Right.
so I think you have to remember, sometimes it has nothing to do with you. You probably gave a fantastic reading and you just said something that hit a nerve that that person was not ready to confront in that environment at that moment. And you just happened to spill out the truth. So you can't blame that person for reacting the way they react against you because you told them something they weren't ready to hear. I've done that myself where I react in a very hyper defensive manner. And I'm sure you have done that too when someone says something is the truth, but you didn't want it, like there's people around. You're like, why did you tell me this at this moment? So I feel it's
Yes.
not always their fault. You said something that hit a raw nerve and there's people around or they just didn't want it. So, you have to know that as well.
Yeah, I think all of this just reminds me of how to be a good tarot reader, you really need to work on yourself and get comfortable, I think, in in your own skin. I think that makes the whole process of reading tarot easier.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I want to say thank you so much, Benebell, for agreeing to chat with me here today about
Always,
tarot.
always.
I hope people watching have, I'm sure that they've taken something of value that they can, take back to their tarot practice. And I just want to ask you, where can people find you if they want to find out more about you, more about your books? Where can they find you?
My website, benebellwen.com. If you go there, I have a blog. My contact information is there. So, or look me up on Facebook, friend me on Facebook, and we can chat.
Nice. Okay, great. I'll put links to your blog and your Facebook page just below this video. So once again, thank you.
Thank you, Kate.